Welcome to Delicate Fire. Today we'll be exploring the aphorisms of effective choice by Forrest Landry. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or head to delicatefire.com and join the WhatsApp community. Be sure to like and subscribe and follow along. Thanks so much. I look forward to hearing from you soon. Forrest, great to be with you again. And today we're going to be talking about ethics and morality and distinguishing between ethics and morality. And we have the question of what is ethics, which we have this general sense of. We've covered this effective choice and ethics as being this study of effective choice. But in terms of morality, maybe you can just kind of talk a little bit more about how are morals different than ethics?
So the way I'm using these terms, which is a little bit at variance with other philosophers, is I tend to think about morality as being a code that applies in a particular context. So for a given group of people in a given situation, the rules of behavior would basically be called a moral code for that group or for that situation. So you see things like, legal ideas or, written down notions of, what are our best practices in the community? What are our ways of being together that we have come to some sort of agreement on as a way of kind of conducting our civilization. So in this sense, something like a constitution or something like a, rules of conduct, codes of conduct, all of that to me has the sort of specificity that makes it a moral code. The fact that that's a notion isn't necessarily that abstract. It's just sort of a specificity to a particular situation that makes it moral. Whereas when I'm thinking about ethics, I notice that it's a more abstract notion. It's not really particular to a particular group of people or a particular time period or a particular culture or even a particular situation. So for instance, we might say something like, okay, you have an email forum, and in that email forum, if you write all caps, then people will perceive you as yelling, basically, or they won't be able to tell whether you mean Polish or Polish because you can't tell the capitalization of the first letter of the word relative to the others and such. So there's a sense in which we could say, well, as a moral code within the email domain, write lowercase and do regular capitalization, because if it's all caps, people are going to be like wondering what's bothering you, right? Whereas ethics is going to talk about more abstract things, like what does it mean to communicate and, to have more general notions as to what constitutes health and well-being in that community in a way that is general to every community. Like the kinds of things that we would say, well, communities tend to work better when people tend to care for one another. Well, that to me feels more like a ethical statement than a moral statement. And again, many philosophers have not made this sort of distinction between embodied specific codes, particular to a situation, particular to a world or a group of people or a culture or something, and these general notions, these general ideas, which are taken as kind of perennial truths in all contexts. So in this specific case, I'm personally going to distinguish it that way. I'm going to basically refer to ethics as the principles out of which moral codes are instantiations. And so in effect, this is a bit like saying, for example, well, I can study astrophysics and think about the motions of bodies and planets based in terms of gravitation or, general relativity principles and so on. And those would be like, they're true in a sense that doesn't refer to some specific solar system. It's just going to say if I have, a body of mass M and another body of mass M2, they're going to basically be in some sort of orbit or some sort of interaction. I can describe that generally in a sense of the mathematics are going to follow the same equations. But I can plug into that specifics. I can say, okay, well, the moon is this mass and the earth is this mass and the sun is this mass. And given these positions at this time, what comes next and how do we account for that? So in effect, we have this general notion of the underlying mathematics, and then we have the particular situation in which we're instantiating those mathematics with the particular constants of the mass of the moon, the sun, and the earth and their positions and so on. And then from there, we can calculate what happens next. So in this sense, ethics is like the underlying mathematics, and the moral codes are the kinds of things of when we apply those maths to this specific situation, here's what we notice that we need to account for. And so in that sense, I find that if I'm going to be helpful as a philosopher, I'm more often going to look at what are the ethics, like what are the fundamental principles of ethics? And then how do we translate those into moral codes for a given situation in a way that is faithful to the underlying ethics? So in this sense, if we look at, say, codes of conduct for a given institution, for example, and the society slowly changes over time, the culture that corporation is embedded in, that's, got these rules of conduct, or the church that is within some larger society, that's got a government and so on. Again, as the language evolves, as the sort of default as to what is the culture basically holding as valuable changes over time, then gradually the codes of conduct for an institution or a church or something is going to start to go out of date, basically. It's going to become less and less relevant as a guide for behavior and cooperation among people. So in this sense, every now and then you kind of need to rewrite the moral code, and then the question becomes, well, on what basis are we going to do this? Like who, quote unquote, has the authority to do that, and on what basis are they going to make those choices? Well, this is where we go from particular situations back to underlying principles. You need to know what is an underlying ethics that you can refer back to and say, these are just perennial truths of communication or of integrity or of living well and fully, as we were talking previously. So in a sense, to maximize creativity and experience in a given population, in a given group of people, individually and collectively, and not have that become, a whole bunch of problems, basically. The moral code effectively is a sort of heuristic that just makes it easier for people to get along. But when people are not getting along, when you're in the liminal space of the old codes don't work anymore, then you kind of need to consult the operating system, so to speak, and find out, well, what are the API calls that are available? What are the actual underlying truths of mathematics and computer science that I can rely on to essentially develop this new code, this new software that's going to run to sort of help humanity get along with itself, to make better choices, to be wiser, to be more responsive, to have conscious, sustainable evolution, as I mentioned earlier. And again, I'm using those terms in a very specific way. I don't really want other people to use that language unless they fundamentally know what that is. But there's a sense here in which, if we are really getting down to what are the principles that make it possible for life to work, and I mean that both at a cellular level and at a human relational level and kind of at a global ecosystem level, because it's the same throughout, that these underlying principles are going to be things that fundamentally we're just going to have to align to, much the same way that we would align to, say, the laws of physics or the fact of gravitation. Like, you can have the idea in your head that I'm going to go fly away and pull a Peter Pan or something like that, but that's not actually just going to work just because you think it. It's going to be something that you have to, in a sense, account for gravity. And so in the same sort of way, all codes are going to need to account for the gravitation of the just laws of the universe, the laws of integrity, and so on and so forth. And these are natural laws rather than civil laws. So in this sense, I would say natural laws are more like what I think about as ethics, and civil laws are more what I think about as a civil code. So, or, a moral code in this case. So in this particular sense, it's genuinely a bad idea to have your civil laws require you to do things which are inconsistent with the laws of physics. That's just going to get a lot of people punished for no real reason. And of course, if you're wanting to punish people, you might as well just do it rather than inventing these fake reasons. So there's a sense in which, we're really actually just trying to help people to get along. And so rather than requiring that every single person understand the laws of physics, which, by the way, is a lot of work, like to understand how mathematics works, or to understand how computer science works, or to understand how laws of physics work. This requires essentially quite a bit of study on the part of an individual, 4-year degree or some sort or another at the very minimum to really just get to a point where you have a rough understanding as to how all this sort of stuff goes. But in day-to-day life, you don't need to really understand how gravitation works. You just need to know that if I have a heavy object, it's going to be hard to lift. Or if I let go, it's going to go down. So in effect, there's a sense in which we need the moral codes as a kind of heuristic so that we can kind of learn how to adapt to particular situations without having to do like these massive calculations, like I mentioned in astrophysics. You don't really need to care about all that level of detail most of the time. And when you do need to care about that level of detail, when you're in a situation where the heuristics don't work, then, well, in the legal system, we have lawyers and courts and so on and so forth. But in the deeper sense, when even those aren't, sufficing, that at some point or another, you're going to recourse to laws of physics kind of stuff, which unfortunately includes things like guns. So in this sense, there's a notion here that we kind of want to get the ethics right so that we don't have to resort to essentially conflicting with one another in a sense that uses laws of physics type stuff, because that's generally unpleasant and disintegrating for lots of people, literally and figuratively.
Hmm.
So in this sense, I basically therefore am saying, okay, well, given that moral codes need updates from time to time, and you can kind of know when that is because people are starting to suffer more, that things become more and more uncomfortable. The world overall ends up feeling a lot more hostile. And yeah, we're noticing, this sort of political divide thing going on. At some point or another, we need to be present with what are the true principles of reality? What are the true principles of ethics? And so in that sense, there's a kind of sense and sensibility, there's a kind of reasonableness, a kind of fundamental principle that we need to get back in touch with to really be able to navigate the liminal space of just not knowing the answer before that point, before actually being in touch with the truth of what is. And this is a very tantric practice, essentially a willingness to be present with the truth as a kind of skillfulness. That's like the fundamental essence of what Tantra is about, fundamentally. So you'll see this sort of triple of principles, practice, and what we might think of as a kind of rule system. So when the rules fail, you go back to principles, you create new practices, and then from there you can develop these simplified heuristics that most people can follow and work just fine. And when those stop working, then you kind of need to go through this cycle again. And so in this sense, it's really pretty important, particularly in times of profound change, like today, that there's a sense in which we need to get back in touch with what are the principles of a non-relativistic ethics fundamentally.
What came to mind was something along the lines of good and bad, right and wrong, and using those words in the context of our daily actions. Which ones fit into ethics? Which ones fit into morals?
Yeah, this is actually a truly excellent question. And it really gets at the nuance of some of this really quite well. So the metaphysics from which all of this material is derived, like literally everything that I've told you is based upon a deeper set of concepts which work in terms of triples. And the ethics is understood, like a non-relativistic ethics is going to be understood in terms of this deeper basis of triples. And that's fundamentally a non-dual system, right? It's not two, it's at least three. And I'm just going to explicitly say that, understanding things in terms of threes and sixes and nines and so on it just works. The same way that triangles just work for constructing stiff structures that you can create skyscrapers out of, for example. So there's a notion here that if I think of morality as being a simplification, then I can simplify a base 3 way of thinking to a base 2 way of thinking. So I can basically now use the terminology of good and bad, pure and impure, or clear and unclear, and so on. But there's an underlying triplicate reality. And so in a sense, usually when we notice that terms like good and bad are no longer really working because there's too much nuance to be contained within the simplification of that, then we find ourselves reverting back to, as I was mentioning earlier, kind of triplicate ethical understanding. So in this sense, it's actually very much directly the case that if you're thinking in terms of good or bad, you are working within a moral system, not an ethical one. And there's a lot of nuanced reasons to sort of hold that as a kind of heuristic of thinking about heuristics, basically. So I noticed, for example, that rather than thinking in terms of good or bad, I might think in terms of something that is zero positive, i.e. like a scale where I have a 0, some sort of unit or a 1, and then some sort of extent, as in maybe the scale has a maximum of 10, but to know what 10 is, I have to know what 1 is, and to know what 1 is, I got to have it in relation to 0. So I can take this distance between 0 and 1 and kind of copy it a few times to say, oh, there's 10 units in this distance. Or in the actual case of a number line, for example, I would say, well, it goes up from 0 to infinity. Technically speaking, just as an aside, there's more than one kind of infinity, but that's a digression for another. If we were to sort of say, well, I'm going to think in terms of this scale, like temperature, for example. It has some low number, some unit number, and some top number. So there's a concept of a zero, a unit, and an extent. That is, as it turns out, the simplest way to think about the notion of measurement. So rather than treating a categorization of black or white, I'm going to basically be talking about a spectrum of degrees between some low end, some high end, and some range in between that I can kind of think about distance. And so in this sense, we notice, for example, that if the categorization thing doesn't work, if we can't fit everything into two buckets, for example, or that doesn't fit into a finite set of buckets, then we can use this sort of continuum concept to have a more nuanced way to describe things. Like, hot and cold can become just Fahrenheit temperature, if you're in the English system of thinking, or Celsius if you're in the more international way of thinking. And there's a sense in which this nuance of, well, it's 72 degrees. Well, for some people, that's going to feel cold. And for other people, that's going to feel hot, depending upon whether or not maybe you grew up in a northern climate or a southern one. And so in this sense, we can kind of upgrade from very rudimentary binary type concepts to things like this triplication of zero, unit, and extent as a triplicate concept that is more capable of holding this notion of measure, or this notion of spectrum, or degrees of experience of one sort or another. And to do that is essentially to move away from this sort of moral categorization to something which, although not all the way to thinking about ethics in some sort of foundational sense, is at least closer, because it's something that reflects more of the truth of reality, basically. And so in this sense, we can start to say, okay, well, as we notice we need more and more upgrades in our thinking process, we're kind of coming closer and closer to some expression of these underlying principles. So that's kind of how I would treat that. I don't find that binary classification systems work very well, or even, notion of classification itself as a way of dividing everything up into discrete categories has utility in some places, but honestly, as a heuristic, it's been overused and overextended so much that it's just become convenient to basically, do some of these transformations to use more sophisticated ways of holding these notions so that we can actually think about this stuff clearly. And that becomes, again, really greatly enabled by understanding, say, the non-relativistic ethics as a primary basis upon which to organize thinking about what means effective choice in this case.
Thank you, Forrest. Appreciate it. I'll see you next week. This was Delicate Fire. Thank you so much for joining us, where we explore the aphorisms of effective choice. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or head to delicatefire.com and join the WhatsApp community. Please like and subscribe if you want to follow along. And I look forward to seeing you next week.